I'm not even bothered by that term weak, as long as we understand that it's being used in the same way we would talk about a newborn baby. Not weakness in constitution, but by virtue of the fact that they had not yet had long time to internalize all of these doctrines and figure out how to apply them completely. They had not had the full revelation even yet.
It's just like a new Christian.
Right.
Any new Christian. You may be strong in your belief, in your faith, but in your knowledge, you haven't had time to grow in your wisdom.
Exactly. I think that's a fair way to talk about it. So that is absolutely true. That is part of the condition of the early church. These people were confronting things for the very first time with their young faith and going, okay, how do we respond to this? And a lot of these, especially these early letters, are instructions about what matters and what doesn't matter and what's part of the faith and what's not part of the faith and how to respond. Do children know how to respond to every circumstance that they find themselves in? And the answer is no. Here's a great example. Just came to my head. It may end up being a terrible example, but it seems like a great example right now. You take a small child, and let's say he overhears his parents talking about something, and then he's in a social setting where the parents understand that that particular piece of information is not necessary to be broadcast in that setting. What will the small child often do with the knowledge that they have? Just blurt it out. Now, it may be true, and it may be absolutely right, but the child doesn't yet understand where to apply that information and where not to apply that information. When it's appropriate to apply that information and when it's not appropriate to apply it. And so you get those embarrassing moments where improper things are said. Not improper because they're not true, but improper because it's not the right time and place. Children don't know that. How long does it take children to develop that skill? Some of us never do. Some of us are constantly putting our foot in our mouth and saying things that would probably be best unsaid. Go ahead.
Like what you're getting into Galatians, where Paul is refusing them and falling back under the Judaism and under the old law, and instead of faith in Christ.
Right. And so I put this up here primarily just to help us remember and recall that this letter was written very early in this process. Jesus is crucified around here. This letter's written within 15 years of that event. And so this is pretty early in the process. Now, I raised this question a moment ago. What was going on in the church during those years? That's one truth was brought out, that the church was very infantile, both in its knowledge and its wisdom. What else is true about the church during this time frame?
A mix of cultures.
Okay, there's a huge mix of cultures, and a mix of cultures that is very much unwelcomed. And in fact, there's two mixes of cultures that are taking place. Initially between the Jews and the Samaritans, as the word went through all Judea and some of the Samaritans were converted. And then eventually Gentiles are being converted, and the Jews have a big issue with that. And what happens with the conflict between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians? Anybody have any thoughts?
Started telling them they had to become Jews to keep the law. They're like, well, okay, if we got to let you in, yeah, okay, but you've got to be like us.
Right. If we got to let you in, then we'll do it, but there's some things you need to do. And those things ultimately centered around what was the general attitude of the Jews. Even Jewish Christians, by the way. They certainly held on to circumcision. They held on to their place of being the offspring of Abraham as being something significant and important. There were aspects of keeping the law, like dietary restrictions and such, that they held on to. And generally what you would say about them is they were arrogant enough to believe who was the better Christian. They were. You're not quite there yet. There's something. You need to first come around and accept these principles from the law of Moses, then you'll really be Christians.
Paul refuted their belief about Abraham too.
Yes, Paul deals with a lot of it. And that's why that's a subject matter in this letter, because these are the things that they're confronting. And what do you do with that? What's a Gentile Christian supposed to do with that? Is there any doubt that Christianity came from the Jews? Listen, Jesus himself affirmed that Christianity arose from the Jews, didn't he? When he was talking to the Samaritan woman. Salvation comes from the Jews. That's his language. So there's no doubt that that's where it comes from. So when these, we call them Judaizing teachers, come around saying, hey, you still have to honor these aspects of Judaism as a Christian, what's a Gentile convert supposed to do? Not only that, we get a few folks sprinkled in there. I'll use Timothy as an example, who is actually circumcised after the church is around, after he's a Christian. And why was he circumcised?
So the Jews wouldn't have anything to complain about.
Yep. Paul encouraged him to do it so that as they traveled and did their work, Jewish brethren wouldn't have any complaints against him. Now, it's important also to note there's something unique about Timothy that isn't true about some other folks. And we're going to read about one of these cases in this book. We'll get to a discussion of someone who actually did not get circumcised, even though there were some people who wanted him to. What was unique about Timothy that may have swayed Paul into saying, well, just go ahead and do it? One of Timothy's parents was a Jew. And so he would have been readily accepted by Jewish brethren if he was only circumcised. Where if he's not circumcised, that's almost an affront to their heritage and their ethnicity. And so Paul encourages him to go ahead and do it and not let that become a stumbling block. Because is it wrong for a Christian to be circumcised? That's a loaded question, guys. Think about it carefully before you answer. Is it wrong for a Christian to be circumcised?
If you got the right belief about it.
The answer is no, it's not wrong for a Christian to be circumcised unless it's done as an act of faith, arguing that this is something that must be done in order to be saved by Christ. That would be a problem. But just being circumcised isn't a problem, or there's a whole lot of Americans that are in trouble. Because circumcision generally is practiced in the U.S. even still to this day. There's more and more children that are not circumcised, but why is that? Because parents say don't do it. Not because the hospital's not prepared to do it. So, there's a big difference between doing something and doing something as an act of faith that you are saying is associated with your salvation. Not anything inherently wrong with it, but it becomes a big problem if you're telling people it must be done in order for them to be right with God. So all of that's going on during this early time. These missionary journeys that are taking place on this timeline, this one in kind of a, what would you call that, a bluish color, and this one in a pinkish color, those blocks are the first and second missionary journeys. Paul is going out into the world and bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. Right here in this block of time, now he is dealing with Gentile Christians and the problems that they face, in large part arising from their Jewish brethren. Because what else was true about these places in the first century? I don't know if anybody really ever thought about it. Where was the first place Paul always went when he went into a new town? The synagogue. If there was a synagogue, what does that mean? There was a large enough group of Jewish people living in that city, in that place, that there was a practicing, functioning synagogue within it. And so there are, in fact, and by the way, if Paul goes there first and talks to those people and converts some of them and then converts other people in town, what's guaranteed in those local churches? Both Jew and Gentile Christians. So though these congregations are in purely Gentile lands, most of them, the Jews had been scattered amongst these lands for a long time. They lived in these cities. And in fact, ever since Rome had taken over, movement and living in these various places became easier and easier for people. It's not exactly, but it's more like moving from one state to another within the U.S. than it would be have considered before Rome had controlled this area. So there's a lot of mixture of these ethnicities in these local congregations, and those mixtures create what? Some struggle and chaos in terms of addressing some of these issues. So that is in large part what is happening here. Paul writes to the churches of Galatia for the primary purpose of addressing some of these problems that arose in large part, it would seem from reading this book, in large part from the Judaizing teaching that was going on. Whether these are people from Jerusalem that are going there to stir up trouble, like they did in some other places, or whether these are just Jews who live there, it doesn't address. And I'm not sure that it matters one way or the other. But probably written in the early 40s. A fair thing to do is just say around AD 45. Let's look at how the book opens. I've actually got 3 different translations open before me. I'm going to try to read out of the ESV all the time, but I'll be referencing some of these other translations. Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead, to all the brothers who are with me, and all the brothers who are with me, to the churches of Galatia. Now, I'm going to stop there and call that the opening. If we were writing a letter in the U.S., that's our greeting line. We usually keep it short. Hello. Or to whom it may concern, if we don't know who we're writing to. Or brethren, if we're writing to a congregation somewhere. Or my dear friend, if we're writing to someone we care about. Or my dearly beloved, if we're writing to our spouse. But whatever it is, we usually keep these greetings short. Obviously, this one was not as short and very formal. It identifies both who's receiving it, and it identifies who it's from. Paul, an apostle, and all the brothers who are with me. What is that reference about, all the brothers who are with me? By the way, what is that? Verse 2? All the brothers who are with me. Who is he talking about? His traveling companions. Paul did not go out on his missionary journeys alone. He traveled with someone particular with each of these missions. Barnabas traveled with him some. Silas traveled with him some. But there were a lot of other people as well who traveled with him. We'll recall, if we go back to the book of Acts, when he got to Athens, he was actually alone when he first got to Athens. And what happened? Anybody remember what happened in the beginning of Acts 17? He pulls into Athens and he goes to the marketplace and he is moved by the idolatry that he sees, and he is compelled to do something even though he's actually supposed to be waiting for the rest of his people to catch up with him. He left ahead of them. They were going to meet him there, and he just couldn't stand it, and he had to get busy. But he was always traveling with groups of people, large enough groups of people that at times, what did he do? You'll recall the letter to, I guess it's Timothy. He left Timothy where? And I may be pulling the wrong character out. So if I'm wrong about that, somebody online can correct me, or somebody in the class that knows. But I think it's Timothy. He left at Ephesus to set in order the things that remained. Maybe it was Titus that he left at Ephesus. He left one of them. So Timothy and Titus had been traveling with him. When he was ready to leave Ephesus, he actually told them, you stay here. And you continue to work with these folks, and we're going to go on down the road to the next group. Group didn't exist, the next one, until he was later in his journeys going back and revisiting places that had established churches. But in the early days, he's going to places that don't have congregations, and he is preaching and trying to convert people and establish functioning congregations in those places. At times, he left certain people that he trusted with those congregations that had gotten started to continue to teach them, continue to order them, and he would move on. These were not small contingents, I don't believe. I think he had lots of people with him. Lots of them traveled, and lots, that sounds like, it could be huge. I don't think it was huge numbers, but I would guess that it went upwards of 10 or more, not just one or two.
It was more than he was willing to name.
Right. Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah, he didn't go through and say, let me give you a list of all these people. He just said, everybody's with me. Probably, and there's a lot of scholarship that would suggest this, the reason that this is included is because some of the people that were with him was actually from the churches of Galatia. People that had come from that part of the world that were now with Paul. And he was basically saying, all of us. This is all of us involved. And he identifies that it's to the churches of Galatia. We talked about that a lot over the last couple of 2 weeks. This was not written to a particular congregation. Galatia was not a city. I personally believe at this late date, since how Rome was in control, we're talking about the Roman province of Galatia, which is larger than the natural territory of Galatia that we think of on a geographical map. That it's better to look at a political map to get a feeling of what he means by the churches of Galatia. And so this was a letter that was written to a wide swath of congregations in this political region. Now, in between him identifying himself and him saying, and everybody else with me, this is who I'm writing to, is this thing that probably is either set off by the M dashes in your Bible or is put in parentheses in your Bible. And I read it a moment ago, but I haven't been talking about it ever since I read it. So we're going to go back. We're going to concentrate on those words because in actuality, those are probably the most important words in this opening. not from men, nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. That's the way it's translated in the English Standard Version. In the Christian Standard Bible, it says, not from men or by man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. And then the New American Standard Bible says, not sent from men, nor through the agency of man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. What is that all about?
He's an apostle because of that and not on his own.
Exactly. That is exactly what the point is. We might read this as modern Americans because we put so much authority in titles and positions. We might read this as Paul writing and saying, this is from Paul, an apostle, so you got to listen to me because I'm an apostle. Don't forget that. That's not what he's doing at all. He's not appealing to his own authority. He's making it very clear that this is from God. Yes.
But they all were.
I'm sorry?
All the apostles were.
Yes.
Even the 500 that kept up.
Yes. But there's something unique about Paul, and it's going to crop up later in the letter. So there is some foreshadowing. There's some foundational argumentation that's going on here to address some things he's going to address later. And we'll go ahead and bring out some of those. What's unique about the Apostle Paul?
He gained his apostleship after the resurrection.
Okay? He became an apostle after Jesus had already, not just after the resurrection, but after what? After the ascension, which is even more significant. Because what is the role of an apostle? The primary thing that made someone an apostle, there's actually two tines to the fork. They had to be chosen by whom? By Christ, and
A witness to the resurrection.
a witness to the resurrection. Because that's what they were. Primarily, it was apostles sent out to be eyewitnesses to his resurrection. So when, for instance, Judas was being replaced in Acts chapter 1, it was after Christ ascended. But they very carefully said, okay, we have to find someone who's been with us the entire time and who saw him raised. And how did they make the selection? After they identified the rather small group of people that qualified to be an eyewitness of his resurrection, how did they choose from that group? They cast lots. It was God's choice, not theirs. So it's very important that we understand that those two things are absolutely required for an apostleship. And yet Paul wasn't around Jesus during his ministry. Paul wasn't there to be an eyewitness of the resurrection. And Paul didn't come onto the scene as an apostle until after Jesus has ascended into heaven. And in fact, sometime after. So how in the world could he be an apostle? And he is very clearly explaining the source of it. When he gets to these very conclusive and dogmatic statements that he's going to make, very early in this epistle, by the way, look down at verse 8. I got to switch Bibles because this one don't have verses. Look down at verse 8. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, a curse be on him. Let him be accursed. Now, that's some pretty strong language, isn't it? If someone comes to you and has a message that's different than the message that you received from me, initially, then God's going to curse him. That's a strong statement. How could he make such a statement? How could he be so certain that his message, as it was initially delivered, was in fact the dogmatic gospel that everyone needed to hear? Because it wasn't coming from him. And he wasn't relying upon his own authority, which is actually referenced in that very verse that I just read, because he says, even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a different gospel. He understood that even he stood under the authority that was the basis of all the claims that were coming forth in this letter. Where does it all come from? He is identifying his apostleship. Not sent from men. My apostleship is not from men. I wasn't sent out by a man to testify to the things I'm testifying to. Nor through men. I didn't gain my apostleship at the hands of men, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. My apostleship is directly from Christ and directly from God the Father. How could he make such a claim? Well, we go back and we recall what happened. It's recorded initially in Acts chapter 9. It is recounted in Acts chapter 22 and again in Acts chapter 26 when he's talking to Agrippa. And he is traveling from Jerusalem to where? Nope. That's where he's going when he's talking to Agrippa. But I'm talking about in the events around his... I'm sorry? He's traveling to Damascus. Why is he going to Damascus?
Persecute Christians.
He is going to persecute Christians. He has got authority from the council to go and arrest them and drag them back to Jerusalem for trial. What has just happened in Jerusalem? Immediately before he leaves, Stephen was stoned to death for preaching the gospel. Then he goes to the council and says, give me the authority to go to Damascus and find the Christians who are preaching there and bring them back here to be tried. What's the goal or the outcome that he has for this mission? He's trying to destroy the church. He's trying to get everybody that's preaching the gospel, get them back into Jerusalem and get them dead, so that we can put a stop to this. And while he is traveling on the road to Damascus, what happens? The Lord appeared to him. Didn't just appear to him, but also did what? Spoke to him. Paul both saw him and heard his voice. The rest of the people who were with Paul, he apparently never traveled alone. The rest of the people who were with Paul, the text says, heard the voice but saw nothing. Why? Why did no one else see what Paul saw? Because the qualification was for Paul. What Paul was seeing was the risen Savior, Christ, alive. Who Paul was talking to was Jesus. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now, what can Paul actually be? A witness to the fact that Jesus... Why? Because he spoke to him and he saw him with his own eyes. After he died, after he was buried, I don't know, the Bible doesn't tell us what Paul's general attitude was about the resurrection of Jesus, but he was in and around Jerusalem during that time frame. And what was the general view of most Jews about the resurrection of Jesus at the time?
It's fake.
That it was fake. That the disciples came and stole his body and took him off at night. Why was that the view? Because they had paid people to go around and say that's what happened. And they had paid the guards to not say what happened. It's very likely that that was his attitude as well. But does his attitude toward Jesus change? Yeah, because he beheld him with his eyes and spoke to him, had a conversation with him. And we're told in the text that this is so he could be an eyewitness. When he goes back in, he's told, you're going to be told when you get to the city what it is that you're to do. And one of the first things he's told is what? You're to be an eyewitness of the resurrection. So that's the reason why this has happened. He is making it very clear, and he's explaining from the very outset that the authority of which I write is not my authority. This authority arises from God himself. And that's a very important point because of the things that are dealt with. I got to stop. Y'all come on in. I know we didn't get very far, but there's a lot of stuff here in the very outset that is extremely important for us to understand before we move into the rest of the epistle. Thanks for your presence and your participation.